Joining me now is President Trump's National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for joining us. As always, Cuban Americans can now sue Cuban businesses over the property that the Cuban government seized from them. This is incredibly controversial. It's opposed by the EU and Canada. Every president since Clinton has waived this portion of the trade embargo with Cuba. Is the Trump administration at all concerned that this will hurt American businesses doing business in Cuba, leaving companies such as Delta or JetBlue or Marriott vulnerable to legal action?
Well, let me recharacterize your question. This involves property stolen from American citizens and businesses by the Castro regime. And what it allows these property holders or their successors to do is get compensation for the use their property was put by people who benefited from the theft by the Castro government. So I view this as a matter of fundamental justice. I think that's the way the president looks at it. It's been subject to waiver for many years, as you've said, but, you know, after 20-plus years, maybe it's time for justice to be done. We have talked to the representatives of governments whose companies may be affected by it. I don't think they're going to be terribly proud to stand up in American courts and say, we want to continue benefiting from stolen property without having some fair recompense for it. So we'll see what happens in the litigation. My guess is that many of the major corporations that benefit from the stolen property will reach settlements there. And I fundamentally don't think it will have any real impact in U.S.-European relations. Today's decision also limits the amount of money that Americans can send to families still in Cuba. Doesn't this just hurt the Cuban people who are suffering a great deal under the regime there? Well, it corrects yet another mistake by the Obama administration that lifted the limits on these remittances. And let's be clear what happens. When dollars come into Cuba and go directly to the central government, they stay with the central government. It's the Cuban currency that goes to the people. So what we're trying to do is make sure that the government in Cuba doesn't use this money as a lifeline to keep itself in power, and that the money goes in appropriate amounts directly to the people, family members in particular, of those who are sending the remittances. We think this is the right approach that benefits the family members in Cuba and doesn't prop up this corrupt autocratic government in Havana. Which country do you think oppresses its people more and is globally a greater source of terrorism and death, Cuba or Saudi Arabia? You know, it's a question that really is asking to compare apples and oranges. What we look after are the best interests of the United States, and in this hemisphere, it's why we've identified the troika of tyranny, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, that we'd like to see changed. With respect to Saudi Arabia, President Trump's been very clear. He expects a full accounting of what happened in the Khashoggi murder, and he expects the people who perpetrated it to be brought to justice. He's also made it clear we have enormous strategic interest with Saudi Arabia, which is why he vetoed the congressional resolution on Yemen. And I think you can expect the president, who's articulated that policy very clearly, very strongly, will continue it. Well, let's talk about that, because the president vetoed that congressional resolution to end U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen, which is resulting in countless deaths of innocent Yemenis. Republican allies of the president, such as Senator Rand Paul, have said the president is simply propping up the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. How long is the U.S. willing to provide assistance without congressional approval to a war that has resulted in the massive slaughter of innocent civilians, to bipartisan majority opposition in the House and Senate? Well, your question grossly mischaracterizes, I think, what the administration position is. I don't have the president's veto message in front of me, but I know that a substantial part of his concern was with the illegitimate use of the War Powers Act reflected in the resolution, and that's, from a constitutional point of view, why it was critical to veto it. Let me say, with respect to the conflict in Yemen, that conflict could be over very quickly if the government of Iran stopped providing advanced weapons to opponents of the legitimate government there, and if Iran withdrew back to its own territory. that would be a significant step forward, too.
National Security Advisor John Bolton, thanks so much.